Welcome to Cozy Dreams, where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. My name is Brian, and I'm so grateful to have your company. After all the treats we brought your way last week, I'm excited to bring you another, our very own rendition of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The story itself is well over an hour in length, so you can relax and ease into rest, nice and steadily. Most of us are familiar with the Grimm story and the film adaptations of this classic tale made over the last century. But many different versions of this tale, or ones very much like it, originated in different countries. For example, the Queen's cursed gifts are not always apples, and Snow White's woodland family is not always the dwarfs. The ways in which she is awakened or rescued are many, and even her age changes from one retelling to another. For our version, we've endeavored to keep all the parts you love, while making this story as sleepy and magical as possible. We hope it's one you'll come back to again and again. So, my friends, adjust anything you need to make sure you're comfortable and relaxed. If you haven't yet done so, feel free to close your eyes, and then bring your focus to the breath. Notice where the breath flows to, in through the nose, down through the chest, and all the way to your belly. If you sense that you're only breathing into your chest, you might subconsciously be holding some tension. So, really try to bring the flow of air into the abdomen too, and notice how that just increases a sense of calm and ease within. Now, I want to quickly share something with you. It's an old Vietnam proverb that I heard the other day. You might have heard it before, or it might be new to you as well, as it was for me. Whatever the case, it's a beautiful reminder to carry with us through our lives. It says, if you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help other people. It's so simple, yet so profound and undeniable. Us humans can get caught up in chasing wealth and desiring material things. But I think the vast majority of you would agree with me that nothing brings more genuine inner peace and contentment than when we offer a kind and compassionate helping hand to other people. In our story tonight, there are many moments of kindness and support that ultimately overcome some negative human traits and actions. So without further ado, it's time to travel into the world of imagination and fairy tale. Picture a storybook castle nestled deep in the forest where magic is used for both good and ill. This is where our story begins. Long ago, in a kingdom blanketed by winter snows, a queen sat thoughtfully by her window. As she watched the flakes drift lazily to the ground, she thought to herself that she had almost everything in the world she could ask for: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and kind and faithful servants. There was just one thing missing in her life, and that was a child. Gazing across the castle gardens, she saw a sparkling expanse of white, edged by the mysterious darkness of the forest. In a moment of fancy, she whispered her wish to the sky. She yearned for a sweet baby girl who would have skin as white as the snow and hair as black as ebony. And her mouth, the queen thought, would be like the bud of a sweet red rose. This wish made its way out into the world, and since it was a more magical time and place, her plea was heard, and her dream came true. Not long after, she held in her arms a perfect daughter. She told the king that they would call the infant Snow White, for it was the winter that had worked its magic to make their dreams come true. Unfortunately, just a few years later, the good queen passed away and the king was left alone with his precious daughter. He was heartbroken, but he tried his best to be a good father, and the little girl continued to grow and thrive in his care. And what a joy Snow White became. She was an extraordinarily beautiful child, but more importantly, she was naturally curious, good, and kind. Where other princesses might have become spoiled, little Snow White was more likely to be found befriending the housemaids or following the gardener. She often chattered away at the servants while they allowed her to help them with light tasks. The castle was her entire world. The king was a good man, but he was also young, and he didn't take well to a solitary life. Eventually, he became entranced by the widow of one of his courtiers. She was an exquisitely beautiful woman, with shining hair the color of corn silk and unblemished ivory skin. The woman won his confidence slowly, reeling him in with skill. When Snow White had just turned 13, there was a royal wedding, and the princess gained a stepmother. The new queen was cold, composed, and elegant. While there was nothing outwardly wrong with her, the servants confessed quietly to each other that they felt a sense of unease descend upon the castle with her arrival. Even the little breezes that whispered through the corridors took on a new darkness. The mood of the court became one of watchfulness and shadows. The new queen had made a great show of doting upon Snow White before her marriage. In full sight of the king, she took care to exclaim about the girl, praising her looks, her cleverness, and her sweet disposition. But once the nuptials had passed, and she had the crown firmly upon her lovely blonde head, her treatment of the princess changed. To be certain, she never revealed her uncharitable feelings to her new husband, who was completely oblivious to such matters. But privately, the queen began speaking sharply and unsympathetically to Snow White. You see, even though her stepdaughter was still a child, the woman sensed that Snow White was a beauty. Furthermore, she found the girl to be an intolerable distraction for the king, whom she felt should be paying all of his attention to his new wife. Although he showered her with glittering jewelry and lavish gowns, the wicked queen was fixated on establishing her place very quietly in small ways. She sought to diminish the princess, refusing to have new clothes made and neglecting to oversee her education. It was as if she wanted Snow White to slowly fade away while her own star ascended. With no tutors or other distractions, Snow White began to spend more and more time with the servants. Soon, the queen was ordering her to complete some of their tasks. In this way, bit by bit, Snow White became a glorified housemaid herself. It happened so gradually that with all the cares of his position, her distracted father noticed nothing. Although she managed to humble Snow White in completely ordinary ways, the queen also had a powerful secret unbeknownst to her husband. She was skilled in the darkest arts of magic. She used her skills sparingly and always to her own advantage in order to ensure that she was always the most desirable woman at court. She consulted a magic mirror from time to time. The king thought it a completely ordinary thing. But when he was away in the depths of the night, she would sometimes stand before the mirror and say, looking glass on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" At this, the mirror would fill with dark, swirling mist, and a wizened voice would be heard, responding, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Smugly, She would then dismiss the spirit in the mirror and retire for her beauty rest. Matters continued like this until the day of Snow White's 16th birthday. There had been no lavish party, but the girl's father had insisted on a fancy court dinner. Grudgingly, the queen had been forced to provide her with a new gown for the occasion, even though she'd tried her hardest to choose an unflattering color for the dress. Her stepdaughter had nonetheless looked absolutely radiant. Shutting herself in her chamber at the end of the evening, the queen approached the mirror in a foul mood, wishing to lift her own spirits by invoking the familiar words of comfort. Standing primly in front of it, she said, looking glass on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" But this time, to her distress, the answer was a new one. "My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White." The queen was surprised by this pronouncement, yet as she stood in front of the glass, she knew in her heart that she'd seen this day coming for many years. Pacing her room in anger, she came to a decision. Snow White would have to go, and she would make sure that it happened as soon as possible. Getting rid of the girl seemed childishly simple. While the king was away on business, she would send the princess off into the woods and have her left there to perish. By the time her husband returned and launched a search for her, it would be too late, and only bad luck would be to blame. Using her skills, the queen enchanted one of the kitchen maids, instructing her to lure Snow White into the depths of the forest on the pretense of seeking the herbs. Although it was autumn and conditions were cold and windy, Snow White didn't question this plan. The queen made sure that her stepdaughter departed early in the morning with no witnesses, carrying nothing but an empty basket and warmed by little more than her cloak. She and the maid were mounted on a single horse, which would carry them as far away as possible, before speedily returning home with the spellbound maid as its only remaining rider. The queen watched the unwitting pair as they left the castle gates. Then, from a higher tower, she followed them with her eyes until they vanished into the canopy of the forest, its branches waving in the autumnal winds. As they did, she smiled to herself with delight, anticipating her next meeting with the magic looking glass. All would go according to her plan. Meanwhile, Snow White and her maid were completely unaware of what lay ahead. Under the queen's spell, the servant girl confidently urged their horse into the blustery gloom. Snow White pulled the collar of her cloak up around her neck, closing her eyes against the hostilities of the weather. Brown and yellow leaves swirled in their path, and the air bit at their noses and ears. But the maid insisted, with a light tone, that they must go deeper into the thickets and into the wilderness. Finally, when Snow White had absolutely no idea where they were, the maid stopped their horse, pointing down into a ravine. She told Snow White that the elusive herb would be found there. The princess looked at her dubiously, but she'd always had her trust rewarded by the servants. So, she dismounted the horse, took the basket, and plunged downwards into the brush. She was disheveled and tired before long, and she called out to the maid. Her only answer was the wind howling through the leaves, pushing her way back to where she thought she had started. She realized with dismay that the maid was nowhere to be found. Fighting a rising nervousness, Snow White called out for the first time in her life. She felt completely lost and alone. The afternoon became a blur, as she plunged aimlessly through the forest, eventually dropping her empty basket. As she became increasingly tired and exhausted, she felt like she was walking in circles. Her fingers and toes became numb, and eventually, she was overcome by a feeling of hopelessness. Just when she thought she couldn't go another step, she spotted what appeared to be a cabin up ahead. Wiping the frozen tears from her eyes, she renewed her energy, pushing through the scratching branches until she emerged in a clearing. The windows of the little house were dark, but she still knocked on the door, although she had been raised with good manners. When nobody answered, she nonetheless pushed the door open. She had to find shelter, or she knew she would not last the night. When she first entered the cabin, she could not make out the interior. The fireplace was cold and dark. However, as her sight adjusted, she could see that she was standing in what appeared to be a bunkhouse. There was a long table down the middle, with 3 seats on each side and one at the end. Along the back wall of the cabin, there were 4 identical beds, and next to the door, in the front of the cabin, there were 3 more. All 7 of the beds were unmade, and there were crumbs and used plates standing about on the table, along with half a loaf of bread. If someone still lived here, they were not concerned with tidiness, she reflected. She wanted very much to warm herself, so she used the woodpile next to the hearth to start a fire. Once she had a cheerful blaze flickering, and her fingers were tingling with life, her gaze fell upon the loaf of bread. Until that moment, she had not realized how hungry she was. But she had not had a morsel to eat since leaving the castle that morning. It seemed, she thought ruefully, a lifetime ago. Unable to resist the temptation, she used a bucket of water to wash a set of utensils, and then hastily cut herself a thick slice of bread. Sinking into one of the chairs, which were all oddly small, she ravenously consumed the delicious slice, slumping her shoulders with relief. Then, peering in a nearby pitcher, she saw that it contained some water. She drank it dry, with her stomach full, and the warmth of the fireplace relaxing her. Snow White suddenly felt overcome with drowsiness. Faintly, she thought how she absolutely must rest her eyes for a little while. Casting her eyes thoughtfully to one of the beds, she pondered just laying her head down for a few minutes. She gingerly laid herself on top of the covers, reasoning that it was the most polite way to nap without an invitation. Then, almost instantly, she sank into a deep, dreamless sleep. Late in the night, the 7 travel-weary owners of the little beds and the little chairs returned home and opened the door. They found a dying fire in the hearth and a strange girl sleeping on one of their mattresses. One by one, a group of stalwart dwarves trooped into the room and then stared in amazement at the sight before them, whispering amongst themselves. They decided the girl was harmless and that they would not wake her. Instead, they retired, with one dwarf sleeping in front of the hearth, and they waited for morning. The dwarves were all awakened by a soft exclamation. Many hours later, sunlight danced through the small windows of the house, and the strange girl was sitting up on the bed, with her hands covering her mouth in surprise, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. They rose from their pallets and looked at her in puzzlement. Then, the boldest among them spoke. He asked the girl who she was and where she had come from, for, as he explained, they were creatures of the woodland and unused to seeing many humans this deep in the forest. Coming home from a mining expedition to find a girl sleeping in their house was, well, quite unexpected. In a rush, Snow White sought to explain herself. She had become lost in the woods and wandered a great distance. She knew that it was poor manners to invite oneself into someone else's home, she clarified. But she'd been so cold and hungry, she promised to bake them a new loaf of bread. The dwarves were kindly creatures, if a bit awkward and unused to strangers. They found themselves unified in sympathy for the poor, lost girl. Clucking their tongues about her predicament, they huddled briefly and quickly agreed. She must stay with them until they could decide how to help her. Snow White was filled with relief, and she promised to do her best to help around the house. Brightly, she suggested she could clean, do washing, and light fires. She also optimistically suggested that she could cook for them, although they would soon discover that the culinary arts were not her strong point. Nonetheless, Snow White quickly proved herself to be very useful around the house, and she was an eager student when she encountered a task that was new to her. The dwarves lived in quiet isolation, and the birds brought them no news of a missing princess. They made no progress towards solving the mystery of where she was from, and so she stayed with them, and 1 week melted into another through the winter, until the 7 dwarves could hardly remember life without her. For her part, Snow White was quite content staying with them. She enjoyed keeping a tidy house. Furthermore, she found that the dwarves were very wise. Upon learning of her scant education, their wisest member took it upon himself to begin evening lessons with Snow White. He produced mysterious ancient books and helped her to learn ciphering. She read poetry and legend. As the months wore on, she became just as intelligent as she was beautiful. Of course, it was only a matter of time before the mirror found her again. A couple of months after the girl had been banished, the queen again stood before the magic-looking glass. Carelessly, she recited the familiar words, looking glass on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" She was amazed when it said, "My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White." At these words, the queen was livid. She knew at this moment that the princess had somehow survived, and she was determined to find her. She summoned a famous huntsman and tasked him with locating the girl and doing away with her. Not knowing the princess, he had no loyalty to Snow White, and he readily agreed, hearing that a fat purse of gold would be his reward. He canvassed the forest for weeks, consulting travelers, peddlers, and hermits to uncover news. Finally, someone told him that he had seen the girl living in the house of the 7 dwarves deep in the woods. The huntsman found the cabin, and he observed Snow White working there in a cheerful kitchen garden. She was humming to herself, and even in plain clothing, she was so sweet and beautiful that his heart skipped a beat. He resolved to fulfill his promise by telling the evil queen where she could be found. But he couldn't bring himself to also be the instrument of Snow White's demise. The queen was furious with the huntsman when he returned, and refused to pay him unless he completed the entire task. But the huntsman had no change of heart, as he could see that Snow White was a great goodness in the world, and the queen was wicked through and through. When he had gone, The queen set about her preparations to take care of the matter herself. Using her dark magic, she disguised herself as a simple peddler. She brought a few items with her as part of her deception, but there was really only one very important enchanted trinket among them. It was a pretty hair comb that was stuffed with little sparkling gems. She cast a spell upon it so that anyone who put it in their hair would fall into a deep sleep, eventually succumbing to death. Then, under the cover of darkness, she left the castle with the huntsman's directions to guide her. It was well into the next day when she found her way to the little cabin in the woods. As she approached, she sang a song, beckoning anyone inside to come out and see her wares. It wasn't long before Snow White's pretty black hair and rosebud lips could be seen at the window. Moments later, she cautiously opened the door, smiling sweetly at her. The evil queen beckoned. "Come and see the lovely things I have here," she urged, as any curious girl would do. Snow White came to the gate to see what the stranger had brought. After showing her a few things, the queen smiled as if sharing a secret and pulled the comb from her cloak. Snow White caught her breath with delight, accepting it into her beautiful hand and holding it up to see it sparkle in the light. "Try it on," the queen whispered. "It will look so lovely in your ebony locks." Snow White couldn't resist, as she had no such beautiful things and found them fascinating. She inserted the comb in her hair, turning to look at herself in the reflection of the cottage window. But before she could see her reflection, she was overcome by darkness. As if sinking down into the waters of a well, she crumpled to the ground, lying seemingly lifeless in the grass. Laughing with triumph, the queen turned and walked away. She had accomplished her goal. It was many hours later when the dwarves returned from their labor in the hills. When they did, they found the girl in the front garden, lying in a heap upon the path. They all rushed to gather around her, fanning her face and patting her hands. As still as a porcelain doll, she showed no signs of life. Nonetheless, they held out hope as they turned her head this way and that. One of the dwarves noticed the trinket in her hair. He commented that he did not remember ever noticing it before. Furrowing his brow, the wisest of the dwarves reached over and tugged the comb loose, allowing a thick wave of hair to fall down on her pale cheek. Within moments, Snow White's dark lashes fluttered and her eyes opened, looking around at the dwarves in wonder. Sitting her gently upright, they peppered her with questions. What had she been doing? How had she become faint? Innocently, she related the tale of the traveling peddler and explained how she had accepted the comb. Then, in confusion, she added that she was surprised the woman had left her like that, without even taking payment. All eyes in the cluster of dwarves turned to the item in question. There could be little doubt among them that Filoni was afoot. As they helped her into the cottage, plying her with water and food, and urging her to rest, the dwarves whispered and muttered amongst themselves. Later, when the excitement was past, they counseled her earnestly not to accept items from strangers again. They knew now that someone had been looking for their princess, and that they might come again. They would all need to be more vigilant in the future, they said, and Snow White would have to be very careful. Wide-eyed, the girl nodded and solemnly promised that she would not be so trusting next time. As it happened, Only a few days passed before her new resolutions were tested. She was working in the garden on a sunny afternoon when a handsome young man appeared at the gate leading a horse. He seemed a bit surprised to encounter the cottage at all, and even more amazed to see the lovely young lady who was toiling in the vegetable patch inside the gate, sweeping his hat off his head. He bowed, looking at her with a twinkle in his eye. He introduced himself, explaining that he lived not too far away and that he was out visiting nearby villages. Looking around as if puzzled, he asked Snow White who she lived with so deep in the woods and why they had not met before. Mindful of her promises to the dwarves, she answered the charming traveler somewhat evasively. She lived here as a housekeeper, she told him, feeling uncomfortable with any sort of fib. She dropped her gaze back to her weeding and told herself the lie was necessary. He didn't challenge her explanation, but merely leaned on the gate and began to chat with her, telling her of his travels and how he loved the forest, even as she steeled herself against this fascinating new friendship. She couldn't help but become interested in this very good-looking fellow. Soon, she found herself sitting up, laughing, nodding, and parrying his comments with clever responses, for she had become a well-read, intelligent girl, despite her innocence. They stayed there like that, with him leaning on the gate and her sitting in the garden, for quite a long time. It was only when the sun grew lower in the sky that she realized the dwarves would be coming home soon, and she felt sheepish admitting to them that she had been talking with a stranger. The young man sensed her unease and knew it was time to go, so he swept her a low bow and said he thought he might be passing by again soon. This was his plan now, because Snow White was simply the most enchanting girl he'd ever met. Meanwhile, ensconced in her castle far away, the queen was about to make an unwelcome discovery. Standing in front of her dark mirror, she once again confidently posed her usual questions. She said, looking glass on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? Impossibly, maddeningly, the mirror said, my queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White. Oh, but she was beside herself. She knew that somehow the girl had escaped her enchantment, but she would not leave her work undone. As Snow White and the dwarves sat amiably around a fire, telling tales many miles away, the queen once again began her preparations. This time, she disguised herself as an entirely different type of traveler. She appeared to be a very old woman, draped in a cloak, simply taking fruit to market. A few days later, once again under the cover of early morning darkness, she set out on the road. This time, she knew the way by heart, and she steadily made progress towards the cabin belonging to the 7 dwarves. She was confident that Snow White wouldn't foil her plans again. The girl was outside, hanging the washing, when the woman passed by. The queen loathed the sight of her, with her shining dark hair and her youthful step. She watched the girl happily humming to herself, hanging one little brown shirt after another in the sun to dry. When the old crone called out to her, the princess stopped singing abruptly and turned, showing a guarded expression. How very hot it is out here, the queen said to the girl. You must be in need of refreshment. Snow White shook her head vigorously. She would not trust this strange old woman, even though she was not the same one as before. Undeterred by her resistance, The queen reached into the depths of her basket full of fruit. She plucked the most perfect, juicy-looking apple from its center and held it up for Snow White to see. Then she offered it to the girl. Snow White refused, saying that she was most obliged, but could not accept food from a stranger. The old crone clucked her tongue sympathetically and laughed in a friendly way. Holding up her finger, she told the girl she had a solution. Drawing a small knife from her pocket, she sliced the apple neatly in two, showing Snow White the inside. Then she took a large bite from one half, taking care to openly savor its delicious, juicy flesh. She could see the hesitancy draining away from the girl as her young eyes fixated on the apple. Snow White walked slowly to the gate, convinced by the queen's performance. Smiling gratefully, she took the other half of the rosy fruit. After all, the woman had eaten it herself. What harm could it do, she thought. But she did not know it was possible to enchant exactly half of an apple, tainting it with a spell that would eventually send her to an eternal rest. So, it was that Snow White took a dainty bite out of her half of the perfect-looking apple and once again lay still as death in the garden. Feeling a righteous sense of victory, the queen turned and disappeared back into the forest. She was sure that this time she was finally free of her rival. It was many hours before the 7 dwarves came trudging home. When they did, they were dismayed to see Snow White lying in the path, hurrying to surround her. They attempted to revive her, pleading with her to awaken. Wise to the queen's former tricks, they turned her head this way and that, seeking a hair ornament. But they found nothing. With tears in their eyes, they whispered amongst themselves, trying to think of a solution. To no avail. One of the dwarves commented sadly that they could not leave her there like that, on the ground. They all agreed and soberly stood, lifting her on the count of 3. For even though they were very strong, she was quite a lot taller than they. Slowly, they moved her inside the cottage. As they neared the first bed, one of the dwarves tripped, and she was awkwardly dumped onto the mattress on her side as the dwarves broke out in bad-tempered reproofs of one another. Something amazing happened. Snow White coughed and sat up, putting her hand to her throat. The dwarves instantly ceased their bickering and turned to look at her in amazement. Her flushed cheeks and rosy lips showed that she was once again vibrant and awake. Their clumsy handling had somehow dislodged the poison apple from her throat, and she had escaped her fate for a second time. When she was feeling better, she got a very stern lecture. Shamefaced, she admitted her error. She explained that the woman had tasted the apple right in front of her. How could she have known? But the dwarves shook their heads and insisted she must not take another gift of any kind, be it jewelry or sweets. She nodded her head in agreement and resolved to do better in the future. For what if the dwarves had not returned home in time, or tripped and jostled the fruit loose from her throat? The outcome would have been grave. So, when her handsome young man appeared at the gate again, a few days later, she told herself that she would simply not accept any gifts from him, but no lectures from the dwarves or good intentions could keep her from being drawn to his fascinating conversation or his charming good looks. She even let him kneel next to her in the garden and help her with the weeding. Neither she nor her visitor seemed to care that he was rather bad at it. He kept getting distracted as he watched her lovely hands deftly tending her vegetable patch. He thought they must be the most perfect hands he'd ever seen. In fact, he was quite smitten. But many miles away, storm clouds were gathering for Snow White. It was only a matter of time before the mirror once again revealed her secrets. And when the queen found out that her second plan had incredibly failed, she was determined her third should be the charm. Snow White was innocent, but she was not a hopeless fool. The queen knew that she would not accept a third gift, so she devised a less obvious way to deliver her poison. This time, she drew upon a very special type of spell. She found an ordinary metal ring that was so delicate it was hardly visible. With her dark skills, she enchanted it, although it was really a very plain ornament. To the human eye, it was a great treasure, sparkling with multicolored gems. She made sure it would be irresistible to a pretty young maiden. On this occasion, the queen timed her arrival at the cottage for the dark hours of the morning. Quietly letting herself into the garden, she glided silently to Snow White's beloved vegetable patch. Once there, she took the enchanted ring and set it on the ground. Then, as quietly as she had appeared, she exited the garden and melted into the sheltering branches of the forest. Later that day, Snow White cheerfully came to the garden, carrying her basket. She was now much better at cooking. There was a fine dinner planned for the dwarves, and she wanted it to be ready when they returned home. As she reached into the rows of vegetables, however, something winked at her from the ground. Examining more closely, she found the most beautiful ring she had ever seen. It was delicate, and it glittered with the color of every stone she could think of. Red, blue, green, and pink sparkles seemed to constantly appear on it, as if it were a shifting rainbow of different gems. Catching her breath with delight, she picked up the trinket, and before she could even think about its provenance, she slipped it on her finger. Instantly, she fell to the ground. Once again, Snow White appeared lifeless, and that is how she stayed for many hours. As it happened, the dwarves came home early that day. They had finished their work sooner than usual and were looking forward to a leisurely evening at home. But, to their dismay, they found Snow White had once again fallen victim to a ruse. Gathering around her, they tried everything. They searched her ebony locks for jewelry. They turned her over and jostled her in case she had eaten something. But it was useless. Soon, they were sitting in silence around her, with their hats in their hands. This time they feared they would not be so fortunate as to stumble upon her cure. Just then, her charming young man appeared at the gate. While this would normally have put the dwarves on the defensive, they were too distraught to care about the stranger, and they didn't complain when he hurried to their side. As the dwarves watched, he patted her face and hands, trying all the tricks they already knew too well. Alas, he was not able to revive her either. It was a sad gathering, indeed, as the man took in the sight of his beloved. He was filled with grief. Sadly, his eyes wandered to her beautiful hands. On her finger, he could clearly see that a lovely ring was sparkling. Looking up at the dwarves, he asked if this was a new trinket and if they had given it to her. Puzzled, the dwarves stared at her hand, for they were not human, and they did not see the false gems. All they noted was that she had just the thinnest metal band upon her finger. They didn't know what the visitor was talking about, acknowledging that even this dainty metal ring was new to them. One of the dwarves reached down to her finger and slowly pulled off the adornment. To his amazement, Snow White suddenly took a deep breath, and her face flushed with color once again as a cry of happiness went up among all present. She fluttered her long lashes once, twice, and then opened her eyes. Seeing her alive, the dwarves danced about the garden in happiness. Meanwhile, the handsome young man clasped her hands in his, smiling down at her, and as Snow White raised herself up, she looked right back at him. She fervently hoped that this was not just a dream. In that moment, the two of them realized that they could not bear to be parted, and that something new was beginning. The young man asked Snow White if she would consider being his wife. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he was, in fact, a prince, but he hadn't wanted to tell her, fearing it would change her feelings about their friendship and their amusing afternoons in the garden. Snow White laughed, saying that it happened she was also a princess, but then soberly, she admitted that it didn't seem to matter anymore. She told him how she had lost her way long ago, and that nobody had ever come to find her. She feared that her father no longer cared for her. Very seriously, the prince asked her if she could ever bear to try on another ring, since the last one had not agreed with her. And Snow White teasingly said, yes, she would, as long as she could choose it herself. Meanwhile, the queen did not escape retribution for her meanness. It happened that the huntsman could not live with his feelings of guilt for exposing the princess. He went to the king and told him of the entire plot and of the queen's treachery. In short order, the king had been led to his daughter and was rejoicing to find her alive and well. And so it was that Snow White remained the fairest in the land, and she got her prince as well. They had a joyful wedding, attended by everyone in the kingdom who wished to come, except, of course, the queen, who was not invited, and they lived happily ever after.